Hi, and welcome back to lecture number 54. Today we're talking about responses to immigration in the Gilded Age. So we are building on the last lecture that we had. Our theme is migration and settlement. And the first learning objective is explain the various responses to immigration in the period over time. So we have increasing public debates over assimilation and Americanization accompanied the growth of international migration. Now remember, the migration that's coming during the Gilded Age is coming mostly from Southern and Eastern Europe. These are people who speak languages that are more different than English than previous immigrants, as the Irish in the mid-century spoke English and the Germans easily assimilated. Now, these immigrants are coming from places like Italy, like Greece, Turkey, Ukraine, and parts of Russia. There is a nativist backlash that's seen through the formation of organizations like the American Protective Association and the Immigration Restriction League. There was a perception that because they were living in cities and these cities were dirty and they had poor conditions, that therefore, too, the people that lived there were lesser people. This was further fueled by racial theories and social Darwinism that was developed by Herbert Spencer, seen there in the bottom left. There's also a sense of anti-Catholicism that is a continuity from the previous period. You see the political cartoon from the American Protective Association on the top, in which it portrays the Roman Church in the United States being controlled by Rome and having their hands in different parts of government. Labor unions dislike immigrants. They claim that there was wage depression. Also, the industrialists disliked immigrants, claiming that they brought in radical ideas and that they would organize the workers into unions. The political cartoon on the bottom right also shows a distaste for immigrants, because after they naturalize in 5 years of living in the United States, they become eligible to vote. And there was one large criticism that they did not assimilate fast enough for the liking of most Americans, that they were became known as hyphenated Americans. So they were Italian Americans or Greek Americans or Ukrainian Americans, and that they would not shed their previous culture or their previous identities to become fully American. So this hyphenated American charge is going to be seen through the 20th century as a veiled anti-immigrant attack on people. All right, so we have some legal backlash against the immigrants that are coming in. So in 1882, we have the Chinese Exclusion Act. Those in the United States that were Chinese were allowed to remain, but any more Chinese would not be allowed to come into the United States. This, again, was being fueled by nativism on the West Coast, that the Chinese immigrants were taking American jobs. The United States Supreme Court case, the United States versus Wong Kim Ark in 1898, considered the status of the second generation of Chinese workers that had come to the United States. So those Chinese workers that remained past 1882 were allowed to remain, and what would happen to their kids if they were born in the United States? Well, this court case, Wong Kim Ark in 1898 versus the United States, said that people who were born in the United States, regardless of their parents' status or race, were going to be U.S. citizens, that was going to be a birthright for people born here in the United States. And this is a court case that continues to be important today for anyone who comes to the United States and ends up having kids here. We also have legislation in this time period that begins to define excludable aliens. That means immigrants who are going to not be allowed into the United States. This is all fueled by the nativist sentiment of the late 19th century, and according to the several immigration laws that are passed in 1882, in 1897, and then more added on in 1917 and 1922 and 1923, we have convicts, lunatics, prostitutes, those likely to become a public charge or those that the state will later have to take care of. And then anyone with contagious diseases, later anarchists, and in 1917, the and the American Protection Association and the Anti-Immigrant League finally get the legislation that they were looking for in putting in a literacy test in 1917. So now that all these laws are being passed that are supposed to keep some immigrants out of the United States, we need agencies and screening centers to enforce these laws, and this is where Ellis Island comes into play. So Ellis Island becomes one of the largest screening centers for new immigrants coming into the United States. It's a separate island off the coast of the island of Manhattan in New York City. So immigrants would be dropped off at Ellis Island. They would go through the process. They would go through some medical screenings, and they would be asked questions about where they were coming from, if they had any diseases, if they were convicts or lunatics, prostitutes at Ellis Island, and then they would be allowed to go into the United States. The percentage of people who were excluded at Ellis Island was still pretty low, and even despite all of this legislation, immigrants still made up about 12 to 15% of Americans throughout the entire period. So immigration was definitely large. All right, so many immigrants negotiated compromises between the cultures they brought and the cultures they found in the United States. Immigrants concentrated in ethnic neighborhoods. So a big example of this is Chinatowns that are now seen all throughout the United States. They were established in the late 19th century. They help retain language, cultural practices, and then for ethnic neighborhoods in the Northeast, especially like New York City, they are going to ease political organization when they become U.S. citizens after living in the United States for 5 years. Political machines like Tammany Hall are going to take advantage of all people that are living in the same area with a similar background. So political machines would actually help immigrants settle into the new city. They would find jobs for them. They would find places for them to live or rooms to rent, because they knew that once they became voters, they would remember the organization that helped them acclimatize themselves to their new home. We also have the theory of the melting pot begin to develop. Now, this is going to imply that people that are coming from other parts of the world into the United States are going to assimilate into American culture. That means that they're going to melt into the larger culture. And so this implies that they're going to lose aspects of their identity. And the melting pot was the way in which people envisioned this new immigrant society for a lot of the 20th century. Now we're starting to think about the new immigrant society being more like a salad in which all of the parts mix in together, but they still retain their unique characteristics. The assimilation that the nativists were looking for was actually most often seen with the younger generations, the second generation of immigrants. And here on the bottom left, you see a picture of children coming in through Ellis Island. All right, we have many women like Jane Addams worked in the settlement houses to help immigrants adapt to the U.S. language and customs. So settlement houses acted as community centers, and they helped immigrants acclimate themselves to the new setting. Jane Addams was a reformer during this time period. Her settlement house was called Hull House, and it was in Chicago. Now, the services that they provided at Hull House and other locations, other settlement houses, really varied by the population that they were serving. Sometimes they would try certain services and they would work like a bread line or a lunch period. Sometimes they would help with landlords and renting out rooms. And sometimes the things that they did worked and other times they didn't, so they stopped those services. Jane Addams tells her story of working at Hull House in her book, 20 Years at Hull House, or memoir, and talks about trying the different things, because at this point, it's all experimental, and she's trying to do something that hasn't really had to be done before, now that you have these large populations moving into the cities. So often, the settlement houses had to contend with slumlords, political machines, and lack of funds. So they were self-funded. They weren't being funded by the state. and they were trying their best to do the best that they could for the immigrants in that community. All right. We also have some new social theories that become popular. So, social commentators advocated theories later described as social Darwinism to justify the success of those at the top of the socioeconomic structure as both appropriate and inevitable. So, social Darwinism comes from Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, from his book that he wrote on the origins of the species, in which he talks about the evolution of species as they adapt to their environments. Now, the British philosopher Herbert Spencer read on the origin of species, and he came up with the phrase survival of the fittest. And while Charles Darwin only saw his ideas being applied to nature and other species of animals, Herbert Spencer wanted to apply that more broadly. He wanted to apply it to business and also to people, different races of people, and using the same ideas like cranium size, physical characteristics of people like the size of their head. Using that, he would classify people into those that are fitter and those that are lesser. So it's certainly a racialized view. It used pseudoscience. It was not proved with actual sound science that those that were coming from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe were less smart or less capable as those that had come from Northern Europe or Western Europe. All right, and that is it for a response on immigration. Here's the recap. Immigrants faced a backlash as they continued to come in large numbers. Legislation was passed to limit immigration from China and identify excludable aliens. Assimilation happened, though mostly in later generations, and the settlement house movement helped acclimate immigrants to new locations. The new theories used in justifying business success extended into racial theories. That was social Darwinism. All right, thank you for watching this lecture. Please come back and watch lecture number 55 later on. Thank you. I'll see you then.